I'm Annie Laurie Gaylor.
And I'm Dan Barker. We're co-presidents of the Freedom from Religion Foundation. Our guest today is a former evangelical minister who's written a fascinating book. It's called Preparing for War: The Extremist History of White Christian Nationalism.
The Freedom from Religion Foundation, which produces Freethought Matters, is the nation's largest association of free thinkers. That's atheists, agnostics, and other non-believers. We invite you to join us in our vital work to keep our secular government free from religious influence. Become a member at FFRF.org or ask for a complimentary copy of our newspaper, Freethought Today. Freedom depends on freethinkers. Watch prior episodes of Freethought Matters on FFRF's YouTube channel.
Bradley Onishi is an adjunct professor at the University of San Francisco. He has expertise in philosophy, theology, and American religion. And like me, he holds an undergrad degree from Azusa Pacific University, which is a Christian school. Also like me, he's a former minister. Bradley Onishi has a degree from Oxford University, and he's on the editorial board of Oxford Religion Encyclopedia.
Bradley Onishi is co-host of the podcast called Straight White American Jesus with Daniel Miller, another former minister. And Onishi's new book, just out by Broadleaf Books, is called Preparing for War: The Extremist History of White Christian Nationalism and What Comes Next.
So thank you so much, Brad, for joining us today.
Absolutely great to be here. Thanks for having me.
So I was happy to read in your book that you and I went to the same school, Azusa Pacific, different generations, but a Christian school. And we also both started out as evangelical ministers in a Friends church in Southern California. I was in Arcadia Friends, and you were in Yorba Linda.
Yeah, Rose Drive Friends in Yorba Linda.
Right. So we share a lot in common, and we both would ask the same question. If I had been the same person I was back then, would I have joined in on the January 6th insurrection? And isn't that sort of the basic point of your book?
It's definitely the question that haunted me, and I was already thinking of writing my book, but January 6th absolutely catalyzed it. And as I watched January 6th, I like all Americans, I was horrified and couldn't believe what I was seeing. But I was also haunted by the idea that, if I had stayed in the movement, maybe I would have been there. I was thinking back to 18-year-old me, who was a fresh convert and was very zealous, and thinking that maybe I would have been invited by an elder in the church or someone I looked up to go and get on a plane and stand up for God and country. And maybe I would have said yes. And so it's kind of scary to think about, but it's something that definitely catalyzed my writing in this book.
So before we talk about the subtitle of your book, which is The Extremist History of White Christian Nationalism, your book is also part memoir. And so can you tell us a little bit more about, you said you were very immersed with evangelical Christianity. So how immersed were you, and how did you come to change your mind, and how old were you when all of this happened?
I converted at 14 from a non-religious household, and right away was a kind of zealous person. I went from converting to being a minister in a couple of years. And by age 20, I was married to my high school sweetheart. I was going to seminary, and I was thinking I was going to enter a lifetime of ministry. However, as they say, if you read too much, you might lose your faith. And I don't know if I lost my faith, so to speak, but I certainly read a lot, and it changed my conception of God, of politics, of religion. And I eventually found my way out of Christianity, and nonetheless stayed in the religion game, became a religious studies professor. And so I've now spent the last 2 decades studying these things philosophically, historically, sociologically, and all of that contributed to how I wrote the book.
And so today, what do you consider yourself?
I'm a secular person. I'm co-chair of the American Academy of Religion, Secularism, and Secularity group, and I have many friends who remain within certain religious communities, and we at times have politics that are aligned. But for now, and for the last 15 years, I've been a secular person.
So can you tell us first what white Christian nationalism is?
Christian nationalism, in a nutshell, is the belief that Christians should be privileged in the United States in any form. It's the belief that Christians somehow founded the nation, and that the founders wanted a nation that was imbued with Christianity in some way. So the desire for a privileged Christianity means that, in essence, Christians want to be first-class citizens, and everyone else needs to accept that they're second-class citizens at best. This is true in the political realm, it's true in the economic realm, it's true in the cultural realm. Now, the white part is actually really important because there are Black Christian nationalists, there are Christian nationalists who are people of color, but the story they tell about the nation is not one that says, this used to be a Christian nation, but no more. It's, in fact, one that says, we could be a more perfect union if we work towards the values of independence, liberty, justice for all, but we've never done that. When we ask white Christian nationalists, however, they tell a story about the nation declining. It's a story of nostalgia for a time that was once great and that we need to get back to. They often talk about the 1950s as the ideal moment in American history. And of course, that was before the Civil Rights Movement, before the Voting Rights Act and immigration reform and women's liberation movements of the 1960s and queer liberation movements of the 1960s. And I could go on and on and on. So the white part in Christian nationalism is actually pretty important.
So
I'm sorry, but don't they just basically have a myth that this is a Christian nation?
Very much so. It's a myth of a Christian nation. It's a myth that the nation is supposed to be for Christian people. And so the myth says that the nation was built by Christians for Christians. And of course, there's many great resources out there showing us how untrue this very simple story is. It doesn't matter. What matters is they have a nostalgia for a mythologized past in order to create the present that they want.
So are all white evangelicals Christian nationalists, or is there a diversity of opinion there?
Yeah, it's a really good question. We have recent data from February of 2023 from PRRI and Brookings that shows us that among white evangelicals, we have a strong majority who are Christian nationalists. We're talking nearly 80%. And so 8 out of 10 would be in the Christian nationalist camp. We also have Christian nationalists who are Catholic, who are from the Latter-day Saints or Mormon tradition. Even some Jewish folks fit in this category. In essence, if you think the country was built for and by Christian people of any kind, and you think that Christians should be privileged in some way, well, you're a Christian nationalist. And so it's not limited to white evangelicals, but you're absolutely right that if we look at the data, white evangelicals score the highest on the Christian nationalist metrics of any religious group.
Well, I know my brother Tom is a very devout, born-again evangelical Christian, but he was one of that 20% or so of evangelicals who did not vote for Trump. He didn't see himself aligning with the values that Trump represented.
It's very difficult for folks in that camp at this moment because, in essence, they're politically and religiously homeless. They don't have the strong backing of their churches and their communities, and yet they want to remain, Christians and born again in some way. So at the moment, it's a very difficult position to navigate for someone like your brother.
I remember, and you probably preached the same sermons I did in Matthew, where Jesus said, "Blessed are you when men shall revile you and persecute you and say all manner of evil against you falsely for my sake." We had a kind of persecution complex. Do you think most white evangelicals see themselves today as the group that's being victimized?
Very much so. I often say that white evangelicals are really good at thinking of themselves in two roles. And I really got this from Lauren Kirby, who wrote a book called Saving History. One of the roles is founder. Hey, we founded the country. We're the ones who built this place. We're responsible for the wonderful experiment that is the United States. But we're also victims. If you try in some way to tell us that the privilege we've experienced for so long needs to be curbed, that we need to extend rights and representation to historically marginalized groups. Well, it doesn't feel like, yeah, equality for all actually helps everyone. It feels to them like you're persecuting me. You're somehow attacking me. You're criticizing me. And so the victim narrative and the victim role is really one that they're quick to turn to, and it's very politically effective. The family values discourse, the attacks on school curricula in the guise of parental rights, these are all really defensive tactics, saying you're just attacking good old-fashioned Christian Americans. What's wrong with that? Why are you so against God and country?
Well, Jesus says, if you're not with me, you're against me, correct?
Yes. Yeah. And so that's, it's very easy to say, and I guess in that way of framing it, they're the ones who are with Jesus, and they're the only ones who are with Jesus, and everyone else is against them. So even other Christians or other people of faith, much less secular folks or atheists or anyone else, for them, they're the only ones who have the right path. And I think that plays into the victimization narrative as well.
We're talking with Bradley Onishi, author of the new book, Preparing for War, The Extremist History of White Christian Nationalism and What Comes Next. And we're going to take a short break, Brad, but when we come back, we want to ask about your podcast, your Straight White American Jesus podcast, and why you say Jesus was none of those things. We'll be right back after this.
Hi, I'm Ron Reagan, an unabashed atheist.
When I first recorded that commercial back in 2014, being openly atheist in America was still fairly uncommon. Today, the fastest growing religious group in the country is the non-religious, especially among the young. That progress is heartening, but the religious pushback is fierce and the forces of Christian nationalism are well organized. Our progress won't continue unless we work together so that reason and our secular constitution will prevail. That's why I'm asking you to join the Freedom from Religion Foundation, the nation's largest and most effective association of atheists and agnostics working to keep state and church separate, just like our founders intended. Please join the Freedom from Religion Foundation today. Ron Reagan, lifelong atheist, not afraid of burning in hell.
My name is Bill, and I'm an out-of-the-closet apatheist, meaning I don't really care what you believe, and I don't really think that you should care what I believe. I was raised in South Dakota in a strict Catholic family. I was an altar boy. I served Mass a lot of Sundays twice. The priest gave us this little card that said, in case of accident, please call a priest. I don't really like that idea anymore since I left the church about 40 years ago. Now, if you find me alongside the road after an accident, please call an ambulance and an EMT.
And welcome back to Freethought Matters. We're continuing our conversation with Bradley Onishi, co-host of the podcast Straight White American Jesus, and he has a new book called Preparing for War, The Extremist History of White Christian Nationalism and What Comes Next.
So first, we promised viewers to talk about your podcast. What is the Straight White American Jesus podcast?
The Straight White American Jesus started 5 years ago. I got together with my co-host Dan Miller, who's also a former minister and is also now a religion professor. And we kind of thought we could give people a unique lens because we've lived it. We have an inside view. We can decode all of the sayings. We can decode all of the symbols. We know what it all means. However, we're now religion professors and we study these things professionally. We have done for 20 years. So we have a historical view. We have a philosophical and sociological view. And that's what we provide listeners. And we've been doing it for 5 years. We have about 450 episodes. We don't think that Jesus was straight, white, or American, but we are pretty clear that a lot of Americans do think that. And we want to help many folks understand why that is and what to do about it.
And so why was Jesus not straight?
Well, here's the thing is, we read the Gospels and Jesus never gets married, never goes on a date, never has a love interest. And so we can assume he's straight, but if we're doing that, we're just sort of bringing a kind of heteronormative assumption to the text, right? That's what I like to point out to folks. Hey, he never went on a date, never had a girlfriend. I don't know if he was straight or not. I have no reason to actually think that.
And
so
he hung out with guys all the time, so, why not? So,
And also the white part.
because when I was a kid, I remember seeing that Salmon picture of Jesus, which looks more like a Viking than a Palestinian, So where did all that come from, this white Jesus picture?
Yeah, it's a great question. One of the things that is true about that Warner Sallman picture, the head of Christ, is it's the most distributed image in American history. It's been distributed something like 1 trillion times. It's on mantles and in hotel Bibles and in your grandma's bathroom, when you're a kid, that kind of stuff. The thing about it is it was first conceived in the 1920s during a time when the KKK was rampant in the country, when overwhelming xenophobia plagued the country in light of new immigration from different parts of Europe, and when there was Chinese exclusion, concerns about Japan and war, and so on and so on and so on. What's the point? In response, Warner Sallman created the white Jesus that now really dominates Americans' understanding of Christ. And as you say, Dan, he looks like he's from Sweden and his name is Hans, rather than a Palestinian from first century Palestine, Israel. So it really is a distortion of what he probably looked like.
And I'm pleased to say that the Freedom from Religion Foundation was successful in removing one of these Sunday school pictures of Jesus from a public school in Ohio. We actually had to sue, but they even pop up sometimes where they should not.
Well, another one in Kansas, too. So Jeremiah Kamara, the filmmaker, he points out, he's black, and he says, when black Americans look at that picture of Jesus, what do they feel? This is America. This is, this is a white religion, is what they see it as.
Well, and it really has, over the course of American history, served to hold up whiteness as divine. If you make the Savior into a white person, you're saying that whiteness is closest to godliness. And I think that was the point of the picture. And I think that's why it's remained so entrenched in American culture, and why, as you say, the FFRF has to do things like sue school districts and other people to make sure that these are not displayed where they shouldn't be.
So godliness and purity, all of these issues. One of the analogies that I really appreciated in your book is when you say that Christian nationalism is America's original purity culture. That's a great line. Can you explain that a little bit more?
Sure. Purity culture is something that some folks might be familiar with. It really gained popularity in the 1990s, and it was a way that conservative Christians taught their teenagers to remain chaste before marriage. But purity culture was much more about, hey, just don't have sex before marriage. It taught people that if you thought about sex in any way, you were committing adultery. It also taught that men were supposed to be leaders, that they were aggressive and assertive, that they were the kinds of creatures that God made to be in charge of the church and the household and the state. It taught women to be submissive. It taught them that their sexuality was really based on a desire for love, not for pleasure. And it also, and if you read closely in the literature like I have, it also was a program meant to renew the nation. The idea was as if that teenagers could purify their sexual lives, that it would build strong relationships and families, and that would actually bring the nation back to its true place as a godly landscape. So it was not only a program of sexual purity; it was a program of American renewal. It also taught that things like interracial marriage might be not so advisable because of different cultures and different challenges and things like this. What I would argue, and I do so in the book, is that Christian nationalism has been teaching along these lines for centuries. That the idea behind white Christian nationalism is that the country should be a straight white American, native-born, English-speaking place. That if the Christian nationalists imagines what the American body looks like, the national body, what is America? What they imagine is someone who has a body kind of like that picture of Jesus we talked about, a white man who is the head of his household, speaks English with no accent, who's church-going guy. And if that person is mixed race or somehow gay or bisexual, is trans, if that person is an immigrant, well, that's not necessarily the real American they're thinking about. And yes, those folks might have a place here, but if we really want the true nation, we want the godly nation, we need to purify our families and our households and really build a foundation. And that's what purity culture taught. And in that way, purity culture was really just a function of white Christian nationalism as it has worked for centuries in this country.
So going back to January 6th, your book seems to warn that this violence might not be the only violence. Are you seeing these calls for civil war as being something that could actually happen?
Yeah, I think that we need to be very cognizant of the context that we're in. It's easy to think of civil war as only taking place between North and South. But what I would say is that if we look around in the last 6 months in this country, we've had people who have, in the name of God, destroyed power grids so that there cannot be a drag queen story hour. We've seen men with AR-15s sitting outside of ballot drop boxes. We've seen Patriot Front march on places like Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, at Pride events. Those are all very little fires spread around the country, but nonetheless, they are related to the far right-wing movement, related to Trumpism and to Christian nationalism. And just this week, of course, there was an idea that Trump might be indicted, and he called his supporters to protest. Late last night, he said that there would be death and destruction if he were arrested. So what I would argue is that we've never fully adjudicated January 6th in this country, that Donald Trump incited the riot. He's not been held accountable. And when it's time, there may be another iteration of something like January 6th, where January 6th is not seen as the end of anything, but as the first battle, a rallying cry. Remember the Alamo? Well, some people already are saying, remember J6 and remember the Sixers who sacrificed on that day for American freedom.
And I would also call attention to the war against women's rights and abortion rights. I mean, we have a very divided country where almost entirely in the South, you can't even obtain abortion care. We can't do it in Wisconsin. I mean, it does seem very, very repressive, like a different country.
Oh, it very much is. And it's all very interconnected to everything we're talking about in terms of Christian nationalism, the desire to control the social order, to privilege Christian people and their beliefs. And so what we're seeing is an extremist outworking of this ideology in the form of militant anti-reproductive rights movements, bills, policies. And so I think they're all interconnected. And it's not something, reproductive rights is a great example of, it's not something that's getting better, it's getting worse. And so if that's one indicator, I think then we need to be aware of where we are as a country.
So are you saying you still have the gift of prophecy, Bradley?
I don't have the gift of prophecy. What I do have, I have the gift of, and unfortunately my friends and family will tell you this, is I have the gift of being very realistic about where I think we are without any romanticizing. And it's not to say that there's not reasons for hope in the country. We have, trans candidates winning elections to state legislatures in Delaware and openly gay governors. We have, surprising results on the reproductive rights front in places like Kansas from the 2022 midterms. So there's glimmers of hope, and there are reasons to think that if we organize and we work together, that this is not something that's a lost cause. However, one of the reasons I called the book Preparing for War is I wanted folks to realize that for the last 60 years, a very powerful group of people in this country have been preparing for war to take a country back that they think is theirs and no one else's.
Well, your book goes into all that history. We don't have time on today's show to talk about, Goldwater and the Wyrick and the Heritage Foundation and all this great history you brought up. But in the last couple of minutes, can you talk a little bit about why it was that the Christian evangelicals and Christian nationalists preferred people like Reagan and Trump to a much more real Christian like Jimmy Carter? What's going on there?
Yeah, I think one thing we need to just accept and to stop worrying about is that when it comes to making decisions about leaders, this is a group that always chooses power over piety. They don't care if you share their morals or their identity. What they want is that you will grant them power and access. And if you do so, you will be their man as long as you are viable. Someone like Trump went beyond Reagan, went beyond anyone else by not only promising absolutely open access to things like Supreme Court choices, but he promised, and this is a really key point, to brutalize their enemies. He promised to punish the people in the United States who the white Christian nationalists think are out of line and need to be put back in line. Trump is a bully, and they wanted someone like him because they thought that's what the country needed. And so when it comes to choosing their people, it's one thing to be a pious church-going Christian. It's another thing to be someone who will promise them access, promise them power, and promise to hurt the people they think are their enemies.
And maybe does that explain why, when before we American Christians used to hate Russia, but now look at our attitude, look at Christians' attitude toward Russia. How did that happen?
The sad thing about Russia and white Christian conservatives in this country is that all it took was for Russia to go from communist to authoritarian for them to switch their tone. When it was communist and in their minds godless, it was enemy number one. Now that it's led by an autocratic, brutal leader like Putin, who calls himself a Christian leader, who talks about Russia's religious history and spiritual heritage, well, they are very much on board with him because he doesn't wait for anybody. He simply punishes the people that need to be punished. He takes out immigrants from the country. He puts gay people in jail. And the conservative Christian looks across over to Russia and thinks, well, why don't we have that? That's what I wish we could have here. And I think that should scare all of us.
I think your book is very important, and it is very scary, but we need to know these things. So thank you so much, Bradley, for joining us today.
Oh, thank you so much for having me, for great questions.
The book is called Preparing for War. And thank you for watching Freethought Matters.
Because free thought matters.
Hi, I'm Steve Pinker. In my book, Enlightenment Now, I show that the world has become a better place as reason has been overcoming superstition and tribalism. But the values of the Enlightenment are under attack. That's why I'm a proud member of the Freedom from Religion Foundation, the nation's largest association of free thinkers working to keep state and church separate. Please join me in supporting the Freedom from Religion Foundation to ensure that our government is driven not by religion, but by reason.